Hello, everyone, and welcome to Week 6 of Baptist History and Distinctives. Today's study this week's study that you'll be studying will be looking at beginning with the Baptist struggles for religious liberty and studying Baptist history through Baptist in America up until 1845 through that section. So that'll be the section that you'll be studying. You want to refer the material from slide number 275 to slide number 367. So be sure you go by the slide number, not necessarily the page number. So study the slide numbers from 275 through 367. We sit here as Baptists today in America enjoying full religious liberty and opportunity to worship as Baptist. We can choose to be Baptist in our choice of belief and faith. It's not always been so in the history of the world or in America. Baptists struggled for freedom in Europe in the 17th, 18th centuries, and even here in America. American Baptists have struggled for liberty here, even in our own country. We kind of accept freedom of religion, freedom to be Baptist here in America is something to be taken for granted. We take it for granted, and we really don't think much about it. It's just kind of, to us, normal. But it was not always so. And in your study of Baptist history, you'll discover that Baptists, particularly our Baptist forefathers, suffered and sacrificed to hand down the Baptist tradition to us with Baptist principles and beliefs, many times with great suffering. And that's what you're going to look at as you get into the studies this week about the Baptist struggles for religious liberty. Baptists were pioneers in the concept of religious liberty. We enjoy religious liberty in our country because of our Baptist forefathers. They fought the fights for us to have religious liberty in this country. Baptists are the pioneers and the fathers of religious liberty in this country. And I want you to go through, as you study this week, and study about that and who was involved in that struggle and some of the things that happened to our Baptist forefathers in that struggle. Now, Baptists have always insisted upon complete religious liberty for everyone for nearly 4 centuries. And Baptists carried over their ideas about religious liberty from English Baptists to America. And Baptists in England argued for religious liberties beginning in the 17th century, and they suffered because of it, and you've read about that in your studies of Baptist history. And Baptists have suffered many types of persecution here in America. A number of Baptists here in America, in colonial America, prior to the American Revolution, were whipped. They were forced to pay taxes against their will to support the state church. They had personal property confiscated. They had onerous fines imposed upon them, and some were in prison for periods of time. Some were injured in health during their imprisonment. Baptist preachers were publicly harassed, and Baptist public services were disrupted by onlookers. And several philosophies came together to form the idea of religious liberty in colonial America. And I want you to study those ideas. You have ideas like the philosophy of John Locke with its emphasis upon toleration. Ideas of the Enlightenment played a part in our concept of religious liberty. Ideas expressed by Thomas Jefferson for religious liberty. The revivalistic theology of Baptist leader Isaac Backus with his emphasis on personal decision. And then the ideas of religious liberty by Baptist preacher John Leland, who was a very important person involved in religious liberty here in America. All of these combined to create a mindset of the desire for religious liberty in America. And after the American Revolution, religious and political leaders of the new nation created an excellent solution to the religious dilemma of religious liberty, and I want you to read about that. It was the Baptists, through their promotion of religious liberty, that helped create the idea of the separation of church and state. And that idea was actually combined by Thomas Jefferson. There were a couple of our founding fathers that helped establish religious liberty in America. Thomas Jefferson was key in his concept of the wall of separation between church and state. You can read about that in your slide notes. He had a great part here in establishing religious liberty in America. Also, the Great Awakening had a big part with its people being converted and their ideas of personal soul liberty and religious liberty as converts during the Great Awakening, and you can read about that in your notes. The Enlightenment played a big part. The Enlightenment not only had an effect on the ideas of our founding fathers. Our founding fathers were all affected by the philosophy of the Enlightenment. That carried over also into the Baptist movement for religious liberty. These same ideas that each person has a freedom of conscience and each person has a right to believe what the individual wishes to believe and cannot be coerced by the state to believe anything. Those are Enlightenment ideas, and they had an effect upon the movement. Now, I want you, as you're reading and studying, to study about the struggle for religious liberty in New England. When the Puritan Fathers came here, and they were good men, and they were good women, godly men and women. They came here and established the colonies in New England. And when they came here, they meant well. They were Congregationalists by belief and practice, but they believed in the concept of a state church, which carried over from Europe, particularly England. And when they came here, they brought that concept of the state church with them. And in New England, you had to conform to the ideas of the Congregationalist church. Religious dissent was not tolerated in New England, and Puritan New England, as good as these people were, and as godly Christians as they were, they kept a tight control over religion in New England, and they did not tolerate dissent very well. This created difficulties for Baptists in New England. And Baptists began to form churches there in New England. They came over with the colonial movement and immigration to New England. And one of the key movers of religious freedom in New England was Isaac Backus, and I want you to study about him. He's one of the key leaders in the Baptist religious movement in America. And Backus is considered the greatest champion for religious liberty in America prior to the American Revolution. He argued fervently for religious liberty in America and was very important. So I want you to pay particular attention to Isaac Backus and reading about his life. And here's a good portrait of Backus. He also wrote the first Baptist published history in America, published it in several volumes in the late 18th century, and be aware of that he published the first Baptist history. But he's very important and very key. He's one of the key figures of getting liberty for Baptist and religious liberty in America. Also, due to a set of circumstances that occurred there in New England, Baptists were granted a certain amount of freedom as they approached the American Revolution, and they were key people involved there in helping to support the American Revolution. And so as war approached, there began to be more tolerance, so in Massachusetts and in the colonies for Baptists. Baptists struggled in those early days prior to the Revolution to try to get religious liberty. The Warren Baptist Association, which was formed by Isaac Backus, went to the delegation of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia to present Baptist grievances to Congress, open for liberty. That was not granted at that time. However, when the Americans won the Revolutionary War and the Constitution was adopted in 1789, the Bill of Rights were introduced in 1791, which gave Baptists a legal basis for religious liberty. In the middle colonies, there was more toleration for Baptists. Pennsylvania was founded as a religiously free colony, and Baptists found religious freedom there. So the middle colonies were tolerant of it. What you may not know is that religious liberty was not common here in the southern colonies, particularly in the states of Virginia and South Carolina. In those states, state religion was imposed in Virginia and South Carolina. And in Virginia in particular, laws were passed not tolerating religious dissent by Baptists, and you had to conform to the Church of England or be punished. Baptists were forced to pay taxes to support the Church of England, and you had to conform to the practices of the Church of England, or else you might face persecution and harassment or severe penalties, which Baptists did in the state of Virginia. And Baptists ran afoul of the state authorities when they emphasized that the infants were not to be baptized and that baptism was for believers only, a key fundamental Baptist belief that really distinguishes Baptists from other denominations and other groups. Persecution broke out, particularly in the 1750s in Virginia, and Baptists were whipped, beaten, mobbed, fined, jailed, exiled, harassed. Baptist preachers were arrested, meetings were broken up, and you can read about some of these men and what happened to them and incidents in your notes here as you study in the coming week. People like James Ireland suffered, and other leading Baptist pastors. Another key figure in the struggle for Baptist liberty was a man I want you to pay particular attention to. Isaac Backus was key. Here's another man that was key in religious liberty in America, and that was Baptist leader John Leland, who is considered the greatest champion and spokesman for religious liberty for Baptists in the South. Isaac Backus was key in New England, particularly in Massachusetts. John Ireland was key in the South, and he had a big part in helping to establish religious liberty in America. He was a great preacher. He was a theologian. He was an author. Here's a nice portrait of Leland here that you can see in your slides. And he was important in the movement for religious liberty. So I want you to read about him, study about him, know about Leland. Here's some of the key arguments, and this is key here to understanding what Baptists believe. He argued that religion is strictly between God and individuals, and that religious opinions are not under control of the domain of civil government. Leland stated that a religion established by the state always corrupts both the state and the church. So these are key Baptist ideas, and Leland was a champion of those ideas. And Leland worked to help establish religious liberty in America. One of the key things that he did was he was a personal friend of James Madison. There were two founding fathers that were key in the establishment of religion and toleration for Baptists in America. The first we mentioned, Thomas Jefferson. The second is James Madison. James Madison believed also in religious liberty and freedom of conscience. Here's a good portrait, very famous portrait of who would then become President Madison, James Madison. Leland was friends with Madison, met personally with Madison in their home, and he helped persuade Madison to work for religious liberty in the new United States government. Jefferson was key in introducing a bill establishing religious freedom in Virginia in 1785 in the concept of religious liberty. And when our new Constitution appeared in 1787, James Madison stepped forward and presented ideas that he would introduce a Bill of Rights into the United States Constitution in the form of 10 amendments. And the first amendment that he placed in those 10 amendments was freedom of religion. So in the beginning of our country, through the efforts of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and the influence of Baptist leader John Leland, people like him, religious liberty was enshrined in the Constitution of the United States as a principle of our new country and our great country, and a principle which we practice and live by today. Very important key principle. In the 19th century, Baptists began to move toward missions. The concept of missions among Baptists had been introduced by William Carey, as you saw in your former studies, there in England back at the turn of the 18th century. And those ideas about Baptist missions blossomed in America in the 19th century. And there began to be an awareness of Baptist missions in the 19th century. So I want you to study about that, about the beginning of the missions movement, Baptist missions movement in America in the 19th century. By 1800, Baptists in America did not have a national organization. By 1900, they were a national body with many organizations. And there was a tremendous explosion of growth among Baptists in the 19th century, from 1800 to 1900. And I want you to read about that. And it was during that period that missions arose. And there were things that contributed to this awareness of the Baptist movement. Number one, our country grew a lot during that period. Grew a lot due to the Louisiana Purchase and the acquiring of land in the western United States. Americans moved westward and opened new areas. And there was an awareness among Baptists that these people had to be evangelized, and missions work needed to be done among these people. Baptists in America achieved national unity during this early 19th century period and began to become unified. And American Baptists began to develop a sense of mission. They had heard about William Carey. We mentioned that the growth westward was creating this awareness of the need of missions. They began to see the need for schools for training of pastors and so forth. And a key element in the movement of Baptist missions in America was the formation of what's called the Triennial Convention. And I want you to be aware of the Triennial Convention. I want you to know when it was formed and why it was formed. And the Triennial Convention was formed in 1814, May 18th, 1814, and it was formed for the purpose of missions, to support and promote missions. And it was called triennial because it met every 3 years. This was the first organization of national scope for Baptists in America. When Baptists formed their first big organization in America, it was for the purpose of missions. That's why it was done, and I want you to be aware of that. The Lord raised up missionaries in that beginning of that movement. The Congregationalists started with the famous haystack prayer meeting with men like Samuel Mills. Here's a good picture of Mills, Luther Rice, Adoniram Judson, who most of us Baptists are familiar with. These men started out as Congregationalists in New England, going to seminary in New England. And while they were sailing to India to become missionaries in India as Congregationalists, they studied the Scriptures, and Adoniram Judson in particular studied the New Testament in Greek and came to the conviction that baptism was by immersion was for believers only, and that infant baptism was wrong, and he and his colleagues became Baptist on their voyage to England. And so they had the decency and respect to send Luther Rice back to America and inform the Congregationalists that they had changed, their view of baptism. They began to solicit support among Baptists. And Luther Rice became the leading early chief promoter of American missions in the United States, in America. Luther Rice is a pioneer in the American missions movement. And I want you to be familiar with these men, Samuel Mills, Adoniram Judson, Luther Rice, particularly Luther Rice. So reading your notes and study about him. The Baptists were divided about what model to use for missions, and you can read about this in your slides and in your notes. Not only did the Baptists become concerned about foreign missions, but they also became concerned about home missions, and they realized that people needed to be reached right here in our own country. Luther Rice traveled extensively in America promoting missions, both foreign and domestic, and was a wonderful man, a pioneer, traveled by horseback any way he could over many miles in America through dangerous rivers, frontiers, and so forth, weather, all kinds of hazards to Indians to promote missions. And so I want you to be familiar with Luther Rice. We have a seminary in Atlanta named after him, and some of our people from Piedmont have been associated with Luther Rice or have worked there at Luther Rice. And the Triennial Convention supported home missions. Here's a picture of Adoniram Judson's wife, Ann Judson, who helped promote missions. One of the key home missionaries, early pioneer missionaries, was a man named John Mason Peck. And he was one of our pioneer missionaries here, home missionaries in the United States, one of the early Baptist home missionaries. And he was a missionary and evangelist to the Missouri Territory in the western, what was then the western part of the United States. So be familiar with Peck and what he did. Here's a good picture of Peck. He lived long enough to get an early photograph made of him, but became a very successful man. He even got involved in politics in the state out there in Missouri and so forth, and was a very wonderful man, very godly man, very successful evangelist. Be familiar with Peck and some of the things that he did in his work. Not only did the Triennial Convention become involved in foreign missions and home missions, but they also got involved in education. And there was seen this need that servants of the Lord need to be trained with education. So there began to be this idea of schools needing to be formed to train people for ministry and educate people. And you can read about some of these pioneer schools, such as Columbian College being established, which would later become George Washington University. You can read about that in your slides and notes. And there was a movement from 1830 to 1850 of Baptist colleges being founded in various states and being supported with various groups in various ways. So we see this idea of education being important here in the country. Also, the Triennial Convention got involved not only in that, but they got involved in publications. And the tract movement became very big in the United States in the 19th century. And the believers, the Baptists, realized that tracts were a great way to share the gospel with people and the Word of God with people. And they began to form tract societies, to publish tracts, and tracts became very popular. Millions of tracts were published. They were handed out to people. People would read them. They were extremely popular. And they began to be promoted. You can read about that in your notes, so be aware of that movement too among the Triennial Convention. From 1814 to 1844, Baptists grew 360% in America. Explosive growth, tremendous growth. The Baptist General Tract Society was formed, and I want you to be familiar with that, to publish and promote the distribution of tracts, and you can read about some of the leaders of that movement that were involved in establishing of the Baptist Tract Society. Excuse me. And Luther Rice was involved in that also and had a hand in that. The Baptist Home Missionary was formed in 1832 to promote home missions, and be aware of that and what they did and who was involved in that. And there were other mission societies that were also formed in the early 19th century. So read about that and be familiar with that. Excuse me. Pioneer home missionaries labored very hard. They faced many hazards such as sickness, disease, Indians, hazardous rivers, etc. So they were brave men and women who went out and evangelized our great country and traveled around our country to preach the gospel to the lost and to people in our wonderful land. Another thing that I want you to be familiar with as you go through your notes this week is Alexander Campbell and the founding of what would become the Church of Christ, what we call now the Church of Christ. What you might find interesting is that the founder of the Church of Christ, what we call the Church of Christ today, started out as a Baptist. And he and his son originated as Baptists. Now, Alexander Campbell was the father of the founding of the what was called back then the Disciples of Christ, is known now as the Church of Christ. And that movement has sparked a lot of controversy. It sparked controversy in the 19th century in America when it formed. And basically what the Church of Christ believes, and what most Baptists believe is unbiblical, is they teach that water baptism is essential to salvation, what we call baptismal regeneration. And of course, that's unscriptural. But Campbell taught that, and his son taught that. And he believed that mental assent was the belief that you could just simply believe in Christ, and that was all that was needed for salvation. And then when you were baptized in water, the act of salvation occurred when you were baptized in water. Now, the followers of the Church of Christ would say that they don't teach baptismal regeneration. But when you think about it, if you say that you have to be lowered in water and immersed in water in order for the act of salvation to occur, is that not baptismal regeneration? And of course it is, and that created great controversy among Baptists there in the early 19th century, which to a certain degree continues to this day. But that started with Alexander Campbell, so be familiar with that movement and what he did and what he founded. And that started, interestingly enough, among Baptists. He started out as a Baptist. And you can read about his teachings and what he taught and so forth. And then, too, I want you to look at slavery and its effects upon Baptists. The institution of slavery had a profound effect upon Baptists in America. Before 1845, Baptists had been one denomination. After 1845, Baptists split into two major denominations over the issue of slavery. And I want you to read about that and the impact of slavery and what happened there in the early 1800s and why that was such a big issue and how that was formed. And there were men that were involved in that. That led to the formation of the Southern Baptist Convention. The Southern Baptist Convention was founded in 1845 over the issue of slavery. And I want you to read about what happened, about how this slavery issue came up and how it divided Baptists and why the Southern Baptist Convention was formed as a reaction to the Northern Baptist reaction to Christians becoming missionaries who owned slaves. That sparked the formation of the Southern Baptist Convention in 1845. I want you to read about that, study about that, and be aware of the leaders who were involved in that. Men such as William Bull Lane Johnson, who was a key founder of the Southern Baptist Convention, very wonderful man, but a key founder of the Southern Baptist Convention. So I want you to study that. Well, that wraps up what I want you to look at for week 6. So I hope you will get into these slides and enjoy that. Again, focus on slide numbers. Go by your slide numbers 275 through 367. And we hope you have an enjoyable week of study. Thank you so much.